All right, let's get right into this biblical study. Today, we're unpacking some incredibly detailed and honestly mind-blowing end times revelations put forward by the YouTube channel Ministry Revealed. We're talking about exploring how a single shift in perspective might just rewrite everything we thought we knew about the timeline of the apocalypse. It's a deep dive into ancient texts that could totally upend a 2,000-year-old theological paradigm.
Now, as a researcher, my job today is just to lay out their unique prophetic framework for you, plain and simple, completely impartially. We're going to map out their core arguments step by step. And hey, if you want to dig into the original material yourself after we're done, we've dropped a link to the Ministries Revealed channel right down in the description below for your own review.
So our study kicks off with a massive textual mystery hiding right in plain sight. Have you ever noticed that Jesus says two completely different things on the cross depending on which gospel you're reading? Seriously, in Luke, it's this peaceful, willing yielding, "Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit." But you flip over to Matthew and Mark, and it's an agonizing cry of abandonment, asking why he's been forsaken, or literally left behind. Why the drastic difference in his final moments?
Part 1. The Lens of Matthew and Deconstructing a 2,000-Year Perspective.
According to this research, these distinct gospel differences aren't mistakes, or poor translations, or just different eyewitness viewpoints. They're deliberate prophetic clues hidden by what the source calls the lens of Matthew. The argument here is that for centuries, literally centuries, mainstream church teachings have filtered all eschatology, all end times prophecy, strictly through Matthew's very specific Jewish perspective. Because Matthew focuses on a singular 7-year trial for the house of Judah, scholars just kind of assumed that timeline applied to, well, everyone. But treating Matthew as the universal standard has effectively blinded us to a much larger picture.
And when you compare the traditional view with this revealed framework, the problem pops right out. By forcing the writings of Mark and Luke to cram entirely inside Matthew's specific 7-year timeline, we've basically been hammering a square peg into a round hole. We've completely missed the fact that these are distinct, separate messages intended for entirely different audiences.
Which brings us to Part 2, 3 Gospels, 3 Audiences, a textual investigation.
The crucial realization here is that we're looking at 3 synoptic gospels that are actually speaking directly to 3 completely distinct groups in the end times. This research proposes a really fascinating demographic breakdown. First up is Luke, whose gospel speaks directly to the pre-tribulation bride of Christ, a group prophesied to completely escape the coming trials. Next, you have Mark, speaking to the left-behind sleeping church during the first half of the tribulation. And finally, Matthew, whose gospel speaks specifically to the Jewish people, the house of Judah, during the final half. 3 groups, 3 totally different timelines.
And we actually see this audience separation validated powerfully in the exact Greek wording of the ascension. It's wild. In Luke, the bride is carried up into heaven, using a Greek word that mirrors how a groom carries his bride over a threshold. But in Mark, the tribulation saints are received up, using an entirely different Greek word that translates to being welcomed as guests at a banquet. The specific vocabulary flawlessly matches the prophetic destiny of each individual group.
Moving on to Part 3, Clues in the Robes, the Colors of Prophecy.
Let's look at the physical evidence in the text and see how this demographic separation builds. It is incredibly meticulous when you look at the garments placed on Christ before his crucifixion. Luke records Jesus being placed in a gorgeous or radiant white robe, Mark specifically records a purple robe, and Matthew explicitly calls it a scarlet robe. For centuries, scholars just waved this off as varied human memory. But this study suggests it is an intentional, divine prophetic marker, meant to categorize these 3 exact groups.
And here's where it gets crazy. The source links these specific colors straight back to the book of Revelation. In Revelation 17:4, the text describes the woman riding the beast as being arrayed in purple and scarlet. Purple and scarlet, those are explicitly defined as the colors of the tribulation period. So, that remarkable connection leaves the radiant white robes solely for Luke's pre-tribulation bride, a group completely removed from the tribulation timeline altogether.
Part 4, a 14-year timeline, Typologies of Rest.
Breaking away from that lens of Matthew shatters the traditional, universally accepted timeline. If these gospels apply to different groups at different times, it completely changes the math. It claims the actual tribulation period is not the 7 years we've always been taught. Instead, it is, in fact, a massive 14 years long.
Yep, 14 years, and it splits perfectly down the middle into 2 distinct consecutive halves. The first block is 7 years of sealed judgments meant for the world. This represents the trials of the group identified by Mark.
Then the timeline transitions into a second block, 7 years of trumpet judgments. This second half specifically targets the house of Judah, the group heavily represented by the Gospel of Matthew.
Let's walk through how this actually plays out chronologically. At year 0, you get the pre-tribulation escape of the Luke group stepping completely out of the way of the coming wrath. At year 7, the mid-tribulation rapture of the Mark group occurs right after the seal judgments. And finally, at year 14, we see the post-tribulation physical return of Christ to earth to rescue the Matthew group. It's an intricately cohesive sequence when you separate out the audiences.
And the researcher backs up this dual 7-year timeline by pointing to consistent repeating biblical typologies woven throughout the ancient text. Think about the established patterns. Noah's dove waited 7 days and then waited another 7 days. Abraham waited exactly 14 years from the birth of Ishmael to the promised Isaac. Jacob famously worked 2 separate 7-year periods for his brides. This study argues this 14-year pattern is mathematically undeniable in the scriptures.
Part 5. The Two Messiahs. Ancient Jewish Theology.
To fully explain why the house of Judah endures that final 7 years of trumpet judgments, the source dives deep into ancient Jewish eschatology, specifically the historic belief in 2 separate messiahs. According to rabbinic tradition, there's Messiah ben Joseph, who comes first as a humble, suffering servant. Then there's Messiah ben David, who arrives as a mighty, conquering king to rebuild the temple and establish global rule. The theological friction arises because, as the source argues, Jesus actually fulfilled the Messiah ben Joseph role, the suffering servant, during his first coming for the world. However, the Jewish people were prophetically blinded to this specific fulfillment. This wasn't an accident. It was a divine strategy so that the rest of the world, the Gentiles, could be grafted into the faith. This divine blinding is referenced directly by the Apostle Paul in Romans 11:10, where he writes, "Let their eyes be darkened, that they may not see." According to this research, because of this exact prophetic blinding, the Jewish people are still actively waiting for Messiah ben David to arrive and rebuild the temple. And that fierce expectation is exactly why they're positioned to endure that final 7 years of trumpet judgments.
Finally, Part 6, a new prophetic vision, putting the pieces together.
Let's pull all of these intricate theological threads into one cohesive tapestry. By finally removing the traditional lens of Matthew, the source constructs a remarkably comprehensive model where each gospel acts as a specific prophetic blueprint. Luke's dispensation is a short 40 to 50 days, representing a group that escapes the tribulation entirely. Mark's group endures the first 7 years of seal judgments before being raptured as a great multitude. And Matthew's group, the house of Judah, endures the final 7 years of trumpet judgments, eventually receiving Christ back physically on the earth. It just snaps together perfectly.
To summarize this study's core findings, what we've traditionally viewed for millennia as confusing textual discrepancies are actually brilliant, intentional, divine prophetic clues. The full tribulation spans a massive 14 years, broken into 2 distinct 7-year blocks, and ultimately the 3 Gospels are speaking directly to 3 entirely distinct end-times audiences, each carrying a completely different timeline and outcome.
Which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. If shifting our perspective away from just one single gospel reveals such a vastly different, intricately structured 14-year timeline, what other profound mysteries might be hiding in plain sight within these ancient texts, just waiting for the right lens to be removed? It certainly makes you want to open the book and look a little closer.